Is it on?
Yep.
Yes, it is. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to spend your evening with us and help us celebrate as we open our new exhibit. Before we get started with tonight's program, I want to just give a few credits. So to start off with, our team here that's going to be presenting tonight, most of you know me, I'm Valerie Marvin, I'm the Capitol Historian and Curator. This is Jacob McCormick, who is our photo archivist. This is Shayla, who is our art registrar. This is Brian, who is our collections registrar, and Meg manages all of our programs and is our engagement manager. So it takes a big team to make this stuff happen. And what you are going to see tonight is just a little piece of a really big project that's been keeping us busy for a couple of years on and off. And at one point in time, another person in the room became part of that project. This is John, who has done exhibit design work for us. So you see his work up on the ramp here in Heritage Hall. And then you will also see it upstairs when we take you into the orientation room where the exhibit is located. So thank you so much, though, for coming out with us tonight. So our new exhibit is called Art Adorns the Paths of Life, which is a nice, pretty title, but there's a couple levels of significance behind it. First of all, Art Adorns the Paths of Life is actually a direct quote from a German language poem that was written by a man named Heinrich Weidmann. You're going to have to bear with me. I do not speak German. I've never taken a German class in my life, so I'm sorry when I slaughter things tonight. Heinrich was born in what is today northern Germany, and in the 1860s, he immigrated with his brother Christian to Detroit. And Heinrich was a printer, he was a journalist for the Detroit Evening Post, and he was also a poet. And after he died, his sister Maria and his brother Christian published a book of his works that included a lot of his poetry over time. And as part of this project, we worked with the MSU Translation Center to have these poems translated to see what they could tell us about the family. And we found this line, Art Adorns the Paths of Life, and we thought, oh, that's so appropriate. Because working in this Capitol building, art adorns every one of our paths as we go through the building. Our building, of course, is known for many things, but its decorative art is certainly one of them. One of the reasons we were named a National Historic Landmark back in the early 1990s. And that art is there in large part because of Christian Weidmann. Christian Weidmann, who you will hear a lot about this evening, was the foreman for the decorative paint project to decorate our Capitol back in the 1880s. So his masterpiece in some ways is our building. And we are so fortunate that we have been able to work with his descendants, one of whom just called me out of the clear blue one day and said, hi, I've got some stuff for my grandpa who helped paint the Capitol. Are you interested? Needless to say, I've gotten to know several family members at this point in time. There are at least 4 branches who donated to us, and we are delighted. People are coming in from all over the country later this summer to see the exhibit. So it's been a wonderful opportunity for us. So the people you see on your screen right now, you see Christian Weidmann, his son Oscar, who worked with him for many years, and then Oscar's daughter, Elma. And Elma was the one who kept the family papers together. And it was ultimately her heir who donated them to our collection. But when we talk about this exhibit, the heart and soul of it, of course, for us, and the first lens we have to look at these objects through is the lens of our Capitol building. Because the reason we care about Christian Weidmann and the reason we know who the William Wright Company was because they decorated our building. So I'm going to spend the first part of our program tonight talking a little bit about that interior decoration project. Then Jacob is going to tell you more about the Wright Company to help us put that project in its broader context and story. Then Shayla is going to talk to you about some of the art techniques used in the building. And then Brian's going to take you upstairs to actually see the exhibit and also see some of the artwork in the building itself. And if you're wondering, yes, the scaffolding is down. You can see the stars again. So hurrah for that. So when we opened our current Capitol in 1879, it was beautiful structurally, but frankly, I've always wondered how many people came on first day for the dedication and were disappointed because when they came inside, there were white walls everywhere. And we all know there was one thing the Victorians did not like, it was an undecorated surface. They told everyone officially the plaster on the walls needs time to cure. In the meantime, several governors in their legislative addresses, so quite publicly, and lots of people in the press said things like this: the large expanse of white or light colored walls is somewhat tiresome to the eyes. Hint, hint, start appropriating money for this project. We actually have a set of photos tonight, which you'll be seeing a fair number of, that predate that decoration. So these images show you what it looked like in 1879 when the building opened. And we can see Charles Croswell is actually there in the East Hallway to greet us. Thank you, Jacob, for the Photoshop. So finally, in 1885, the legislature gets the hint and they start appropriating money for the decorative project. Now, when we think about what they were going to do, we have to think about what were people's expectations. I would love to know how many people were hoping for something like this. This is the national capital, which of course there's always sort of exchanges between state and national governments. And of course, many people from Michigan would go out to DC for various reasons over the years. And this, of course, is the work of Costantino Brumidi, who is a famous Italian artist who spent much of his career working on the US Capitol. Here you see the beautiful Brumidi corridors. He is probably best known, though, for the rotunda art, including the apotheosis of George Washington under the dome. Now, when we think about this project, we have to remember that Brumidi was an Italian immigrant, and that's going to be a theme for us tonight. Many of the artists who worked on this project for us were immigrants, and at one point in time, that does become a political matter. Although early on, we just needed to worry about money. So in 1885, someone in the legislature finally says, okay, we're gonna do this. So they start basically paying for the project and commissioning the project in phases. And in some ways, this is not so different from how we would do our restoration in the early 90s. The first phase of decoration was basically what we would consider the public spaces. So the rotunda, the governor's office, the Supreme Court, the House and the Senate, basically the pretty rooms you show off on a guided tour. This first phase was going to include, though, some of the most prominent spaces. So I'm sure there was a lot of pressure to get it right. And a lot of companies wanted the job. Once the legislature appropriates the money, then of course, they put together a commission to oversee this project, which will include some prominent Michigan artists, Louis Ives being one of them. We will then put out a call for bids. And not surprisingly, we issue that call beyond Michigan's borders because no one's quite sure how many Michigan contractors are going to apply. Ultimately, we get 15 bidders, and after reviewing the designs, they select the William Wright Company of Detroit. Now, the William Wright Company was what we would today consider to be an interior decoration firm. So this is a company that does more than paint. This is a company that will manufacture furniture and woodwork. They will do draperies and upholstery. At one point in time, they are in the import business where they are sending over to Europe to buy pieces of art and sculpture and paintings and so on to bring back for their wealthy clients. And ultimately, the William Wright Company will exist for decades. So their story begins long before this project and will last long after it. When we think about this project, though, we have to remember that Lansing was a very small town. So just like the construction of the Capitol, the decoration of the Capitol made the newspapers regularly, because this is what we have to talk about and fill our column inches. So we know, for example, thanks to the Lansing Journal Weekly, that on December 18th, 1885, the work of frescoing the Capitol building had commenced. The governor's room will first come under the decorator's brush. Now, we don't always know which room in a suite they're talking about. Was this the governor's parlor? Was it the office proper? Not sure. We also have to remember they're doing this in a fully occupied building. So just as today, we make, and some of you lived through this, we make you occasionally move out of your office and relocate somewhere else because there's something happening. So we did at that time. I don't know if people were moved into swing space to work in another room, or if they were working in the hallways, or if you literally just had scaffolding above your desk at one point. Unfortunately, we don't have that level of detail. But we do know that people were watching the process. In fact, there was one person who fell off scaffolding in the governor's office painting, and because he broke his arm, that was news at the level that we know his name, actually. So when we think about these spaces, we think, okay, painting project, they're painting the walls, they're putting nice attractive finishes on the plaster and the metalwork. Well, sometimes it's a little more than that. One thing I've always wanted to know the backstory to is who made the decisions about the colors in the House and Senate chambers. Now, people ask these questions all the time. Why did they get this color? Were they trying to be patriotic? The house is kind of a terracotta red. The Senate is kind of a robin's egg blue. Did somebody in the Senate really like blue at the time? Well, if you've worked in this building, you know everybody around here has opinions, and things often happen by committee. I would love to know, though, who in the House and Senate did not like the original carpets put in the chambers. Because these carpets that appear in these photos from 1879 are the shortest lived chamber carpets in our history. They were installed in 1878 before the building opened, and then in 1886, when the Wright Company is painting, they somehow managed to choose a decorative scheme that doesn't match the carpets, so they can't put them back in. They have to buy brand new carpets from the Wright Company. And this happens not in one, but in both chambers, actually. So there's clearly something happening. Now, if you are familiar with our building, you may recognize this pattern. This is when we get the infamous chicken coop carpet pattern, as we now think of it. And if you're not familiar with that story, ask in the Q&A section or check out the exhibit cases on RAM, because we do include actually a piece of that carpet in there. So as we are doing this work, there's definitely reaction from people in the building. People in the Supreme Court were apparently thrilled when they came back for their October term in 1886 to discover that the Supreme Court chamber had been decorated. And apparently it may have delayed getting things started that day for a little bit. It is interesting to think about what people were saying. And did the workmen pay attention to this? Did they listen to this? How much communication was there between the painters? Between Weidman? Who was Weidman talking to and taking orders from? Was it the superintendent of the Capitol? Was it the clerk of the House in the House chamber? Did the speaker ever stop in? Did he weigh in on this stuff? Did all of the Supreme Court justices give him their opinions? I don't know. What was amazing to me, though, as we started to receive the Weidman collection originally, was those moments of discovery that you just dream about when you're in this business. The sketchbook that you see a page from here behind the text, that sketchbook was part of the first larger set of donations, but it didn't come in the first actual box. This one actually came in the mail, just in a mail-in pouch a few days after the initial donation. And I opened it up, and first of all, it has Christian Weidman's name on the front cover. So I already know, like, oh, this is really cool. And then I flip it open and I see the walls in the Supreme Court chamber. And I had goosebumps. It was so cool because for over 100 years, we've been trying to answer the question, who designed this? Who created all of this art in the building? Who selected colors and motifs? And now we knew at least whose brain was behind all of it and who was actually creating what still decorates our walls to this day. Of course, the biggest thing then as now was the dome. This certainly required the most scaffolding. But the dome was painted originally in 1886. So yes, this is what it looked like before it had stars, if you can imagine that. And this was a highly watched project. There was a lot of anticipation. There was a real sense of excitement, but there were also questions. So, okay, how much of it gets painted? And are we going to have murals? Because when Elijah Myers designed the building, there had been talk about leaving some space for murals. Murals of what, though? Michigan pioneers? Well, for one reason or the other, we ended up with 8 allegorical figures. In some ways, these have nothing to do with Michigan, but everything to do with the classical world and with this idea of Western art traditions. Allegories or muses are very common symbols in government buildings. And ultimately, these murals were not painted by anyone on Wright's staff. They were painted by an Italian artist named Tommaso Uglaris. Mr. Uglaris was living and working in Boston at the time. He did work many places in the East Coast, and that's about all I will say because the world expert is in the room. I will say if you have questions about Uglaris, please direct them to Mr. Jeff Drudges over here because he has quite literally written a book on Tommaso Uglaris. We know that the muses came to Michigan and that Wright's team installed them in the fall of 1886. And as we had scaffolding up in the rotunda this past year, we got to see them up close. This was the first time for this generation of staff that we had gotten to literally go up and touch them carefully. And one thing that I was not anticipating at all, because of course the dome is a curved surface, was that we would actually see cut marks in the canvases because they came flat, but then they had to be adhered to a curved dome. So there were actually slashes where they were cut to make them fit on the surface itself. So interesting to think about what was that process like for those men installing them. Now, as 1886 winds down, we are now looking at another legislative session. So the House and the Senate come back in 1887, and there's a hope that we'll just get the next round of appropriation and everything will be fine, except politics rears its head in the form of debates about immigration and about labor. So nice, big, difficult, complicated topics. This was part of a bigger discussion, I'll say politely, around these things nationally. Needless to say, it's often hard to dig through all the layers, but a controversy erupts. There's a senator who writes an amendment to the bill that says that anyone working on this project, both the project owner and also his employees, need to either be US citizens or be in the process of obtaining citizenship. So they need to have their first papers, their declaration of intent to become citizens. There is some discussion about the fact that the senator who introduces this language may have offered the right company actually a bigger appropriation if he would use union labor. So this was part of it. There's also something, though, to the fact that this senator who was playing with this was also formerly a decorator in Detroit. So it's interesting to think about what kind of background he may have had with Wright. There are several senators who get involved with this. There are debates. There are some people saying, yes, we need this. We need to protect American jobs. Other people say this is blatant racism. This is ignorance. We are supposed to welcome everyone in this country. It was a pretty raucous debate. In the end, this is the version of the bill that passes. The governor signs it and does in fact have a citizenship requirement, which frankly, William Wright couldn't care less about because William Wright is already a citizen. He was born in England. He grew up and trained in England as a young man. He would eventually work in Detroit. His business was always based there, but he would commute from Canada, and his wife lived across the river in what was then Sandwich. But William Wright had declared his intent to become a citizen in 1858. So before we even built this Capitol, he was a citizen even before we even built this Capitol. He officially renounced his allegiance to the Queen in 1868. Now, we don't know how many of his men it may have affected. We know Christian Weidman was already on the path to citizenship. And frankly, we also don't know if anyone bothered to check once that bill was passed. You know, there's the law that's written and there's the laws that is implemented. We know, though, that it does remind us that politics is ever present, though, in everything that happens in this building. Now, once that all gets settled, Wright's is the only bid that comes in for the second round, so they automatically get the job, and they just kind of keep doing what they're doing. So they come back. This time, they're doing a ton of work. They're doing corridors, which you can see a couple different images up here. They're also doing the bulk of the offices at this point. So we're talking the departmental offices on the first floor. It would have been quite the process. Then 1889 comes around, another legislative session, another budget. This time, no citizenship provision. No debate about it, no discussion. That's done. We are not worrying about this anymore. Which means they move into the last two places they've been putting off, which is the museum and the library, where there was a librarian who, let's just say there was a little bit of consternation on her part about the fact that hordes of decorative artists were going to be invading her space and working around her bookcases. She tolerated them. It all happened, but it's a reminder that, you know, living through any project is difficult. And it would have been so much easier if we just would have decorated the building originally, but easy is not necessarily what we specialize in around here. So on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Jacob, and he's going to talk to you more about the Wright Company itself.
All right.
Thank you, Val. Okay, well, I'm going to talk a bit about the Wright Company and a lot about their other work that they did. So the left section of the display that we get upstairs focuses a bit on the Wright Company's other commissions. So digging into these other commissions, though the Capitol is the largest, most substantial surviving job that we have to come look at, there's lots of others that we were able to identify along the way. So there's more than 100 other Wright commissions that have been identified through this project. There are 8 boats, which was maybe the biggest surprise in this research, is they decorated the interiors of boats, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. 14 commercial jobs, which are things like restaurants, stores, and offices. We also get 14 churches or places of worship. We have 8 clubs, so think fraternal, Masonic, as well as like gentlemen's clubs, city clubs, things like that. 2 government jobs, one of those is the Capitol. I'll tell you about the other one later on. 3 that we have classified as helping and healing, which are charities, hospitals, that type of thing. 28 private homes and residences, 7 hotels, 6 theaters and opera houses, and 12 that are classified as special events, which are sort of ephemeral jobs, conventions, balls, and huge installations like this GAR Arch of Peace from Detroit in the 1890s. So that gives you a scope of what we're talking about here, and I'll walk you through how we discovered these and talk a little bit in detail about each of the categories. So how did we uncover more than 100 right jobs that had, for the most part, been unknown until we started this project? Well, there's sort of 2 main ways that we went about that. One was using the vitamin collection. So this is one drawing from the vitamin collection, and maybe hard to see from here. I'll zoom in just a little bit. And at the lower right corner, this is labeled as the billiard room for the residents of Hamilton Carhart Esquire. Now, we know Hamilton Carhart as the founder of the workwear company that survives. Hamilton Carhart had several homes, and despite exhaustive research, we've not determined which Carhart home this may have been designed for, or whether Wright actually ever got a contract to work with Carhart. What we do know is that he designed something for Carhart, and it's in the collection. So this is one way that we know about jobs. So this is classified as one of the jobs that Vitamin and Wright worked on, as well as a few others that we'll talk about tonight that root from a drawing in the collection. Another way that we identify these is through newspaper research. We love our newspapers around here. So in 1924, when the book Cadillac Hotel opens, there is a multi-page spread in the Detroit papers describing the building in detail, and every contractor, every company in Michigan, and even outside of Michigan that had a role in the hotel's construction took out an ad, and they bragged or staked their claim to what their role was in the building's construction. So here we'll see the Wright Company's advertisement stating that the entire decorations of the book Cadillac Hotel were carried out by the William Wright Company. So that's an easy one. Those are easy. You look for the advertisements. There are less easy ones as well. If you've looked at a 19th century newspaper, you see a whole lot of little text and not a lot of photographs, not a lot of those big ads. So it's combing through these. Luckily, search features help in digitized papers, but combing through these, looking for the right words, the keywords. So whether it's William Wright, whether it's Wright Company, whether it's William Wright Co., whether it's W.M. Wright, there's about 40 different combinations of William Wright that it takes to search to find all these. And we did that. So at the bottom of this list from an 1883 Detroit Free Press, it says the William Wright and Company decorators of this city are making the Grand Rapids club rooms as beautiful as an Oscar Wilde dream. Well, we could say, awesome, we'll add the Grand Rapids Club to our list, but it turns out there is no such thing as a Grand Rapids Club necessarily. This is going to take a little more research. So it turns out this is the Peninsular Club of Grand Rapids, which survived until I think somewhat recently, when they built their new building in 1883. So it's a surface level search to find the first hint of a job, and then doing a whole bunch more digging to place it in the context of an actual building that exists. So those are the 2 ways we go about finding these things. And then let's talk about some of the finds that were made. So boats are, again, the big surprise, but here's a couple of them. We had 8 of them that were uncovered in this research. So one was the Galatea. I'll let you figure out how to pronounce that. It was a private yacht that was commissioned by E.L. Ford, who's not related to Henry or Gerald as far as we know. He was an industrialist in his own right, and had this yacht commissioned. It was built in Delaware, and the Wright Company sent decorators to Delaware to the ship site, and they decorated it there in the plant where they were building the ship. Ford took it on an inaugural cruise up the Atlantic coast. Didn't have it very long because in 1917, they sold it to the Navy. And the Navy used it in World War I. Presumably, it was stripped of any of the decorations they would have done. And then in 1924, the Navy sold it, and the trail sort of goes cold from there. We don't know what happens to it. This is one of the only ones where we don't know the ultimate outcome of a boat. A lot of them ended up sort of falling apart, being barged out, and then cease to exist. So we don't know what happens to this one. A lot of the others we do. The other one, which you may actually recognize, is the SS Columbia, which is a Balboa boat. It was built in 1902 for the Detroit, Belle Isle, and Windsor Ferry Company, and it worked ferrying visitors to Balboa Island for almost 90 years before it retired in 1991. And it sat abandoned for a bit in Detroit, and we're happy to see that it's actually on a path to a new life, potentially moved to New York for awaiting rehabilitation. So we know that the Wright Company did interior woodwork on the Columbia. So less of the pretty decorative, colorful stuff we have, and more the practical woodwork inside the ship there. So another category that we'll move to then is commerce, or the commercial jobs. This is one of the favorites that I found. So this building is the Detroit Chamber of Commerce building that was built in 1879 at the corner of Jefferson and Griswold in Detroit. And within the Chamber of Commerce building was the Detroit Board of Trade. And again, this is another one of those 19th century papers with long, vivid descriptions of every little nook and cranny of the building, including their big meeting rooms and these halls where they're having their events. And we get this great excerpt that I want to read out loud, and then we'll sort of pick it apart a little bit. So, quote, the paper said, quote, "The upholstery is of red velvet, and above the head of the president, upon a golden panel, is the coat of arms of Michigan. And above the president's chair is a painting in which 3 female figures represent commerce, industry, and agriculture, the surroundings being allegorical." Now, first, this coat of arms of Michigan on a golden panel sounds awful familiar. And if you've been upstairs, it should. Sounds an awful lot like that State House of Representatives upstairs. This is sort of a reminder that they're not reinventing the wheel every time they're doing a job. They're using these things that they know how to do over and over again. The other thing that I'll point out that should be familiar are those allegories. Now we have 8. I'm including sort of all 3 of those, close to all 3 of those. But the Wright Company didn't do our allegories. Did the Wright Company do these allegories? Did they also subcontract these out? Was this sort of their thing? They didn't do the female figures. Well, we don't know. We know that these were part of their broader contract and ended up in this building, which unfortunately burned down in 1911. So this is not a survivor either. Moving on to churches then, which is a robust category. We get the Howell Baptist Church. I picked my favorite to talk about tonight, so I'm going to keep saying these are my favorites. But the Howell Baptist Church was built in 1873. It was their second building in Howell, and their interior decorations were done in 1887. And we get this clipping, which is how we discovered this one, a clipping from the newspaper that talks about how the walls were being washed and the room prepared for the walls to be frescoed by the same firm who just did the state capitol. Now, this is one that doesn't say the Wright Company, but we can put 2 and 2 together and figure out what this is for, right? So we know that the Wright Company did work in the Howell Baptist Church in 1887, which is while the Capitol is being decorated as well. And if you take a close look at that back wall, those might look familiar to you as well. I thought that they're pretty familiar, pretty similar to our scroll work that we have upstairs. First floor, east and west wings primarily. So just give you a little emphasis on what I'm talking about there on the back wall. So that gray scroll work with that texture, the raised plaster work, instantly recognizable with this interior photograph. Another church to talk about is the First Congregational Church of Wyandotte, which just joined the National Historic Register. This was something that had been on our radar before this project started, before we had the Weidman collection. The State Historic Preservation Office and the church had approached us, Valerie in particular, about wondering what we know about the Wright Company, because they knew from a newspaper clipping that the Wright Company did work in their church. And can we substantiate that? Can we sort of tie it to some of their surviving examples? Well, we are the primary surviving example, and not until we got this collection could we actually do that. So again, here's the clipping that substantiates that the Wright Company did the work. But after we get the collection, SHPO comes in and actually is able to review the drawings and starts finding these recognizable themes, these motifs that are found in the church still. So not only are they able to draw that connection and substantiate again that the Wright Company did the work, but that helped them dramatically in their path to joining the National Historic Register, which is a Herculean task these days. And being able to tie it to this important art firm and connect it to us helped a little bit. So we're happy to say that we had a big hand in that. Now, clubs is the next category. So again, this is the private men's clubs like the Detroit City Club, as well as fraternal clubs like Masons, Masonic clubs. And this is the Detroit Commandery Knights Templar Asylum. Asylum is the name for the rooms that they gather in. And there are 8 clubs in total that we identified. This one was on the upper floors of the Wayne County Savings Bank building, which was built in the 1870s. This is a new building constructed at the time. The Masonic group partnered with the bank to build this new building. It was on Congress Street in New York. And the Wright Company decorated the Masonic rooms, including the Grand Chamber, which you see here, described to have had elaborate red drapery and extensive gilding. And even though this is a black and white photograph, I can see the gilding on the walls. I bet if you take a close look, you can pick it out there as well. So this building was renovated in 1905, had some upper floors added. It became the Wayne County and Homes Savings Bank and was again decorated by the Wright Company. So they are undoing and redoing their own work in some instances. And this building was demolished in 1932 for a parking lot in Detroit on Congress Street. So another non-survivor. I'll mention that the Howell Baptist Church has gone. Wyandotte Church is still there since they're on the historic register. Hotels are another big category, and this is one that we had known about from family lore, from Weidman family lore. This is a job that they had known that Christian had a hand in, at least partially, the Winona Hotel in Bay City. And we have a great series of interior photographs, postcards, I should say, showing all that great public space decorative artwork in the Winona Hotel. And they placed an ad, just like the Wright Company placed an ad in this case, just like they did for the book Cadillac. So not only can we say, look at all these great interior views, but we can put some little weight behind that family story by saying, look, the William Wright Company did furnish and decorate the Winona Hotel in Bay City. Oh, and by the way, on the same ad, we can add the Cadillac Hotel in Detroit, the Morton House in Grand Rapids, and the Temple Theater in Detroit. So this is how this list grows so dramatically, pretty quickly, actually. Now, we mentioned the Capitol is a major commission, but so is another really important Michigan government building. That's the Detroit Federal Building, which no longer stands, but if you're familiar with Michigan history, Detroit history, this is a big one. The Detroit Federal Building was built in the 1890s, and we identified this job through government reports. So this clipping at the top talks about the appropriation that was given, the contract that was awarded to the Wright Company for this job, which is something like $11,000, if I remember correctly, to decorate the post office, the courtroom, or the courthouse, and the rest of the building. And if you look at these interior photographs, it's a lot of marble, but we don't know necessarily what the ceilings look like. It could have been more elaborate. I will add, this is the building that the famous $1 million courtroom comes out of. So this fantastic marble courtroom with all these different types of marble. We know that the marble came from elsewhere, but perhaps there were other decorative flourishes in the room that the Wright Company had a hand in. Now, this building was demolished in 1931, and that $1 million courtroom was removed piece by piece and reinstalled in what is now the Levin Courthouse in Detroit. So that still survives. We don't know. It has a sort of a decorative ceiling today. Whether that's inspired by what was in this building, we may never know. But that is the deal with the Federal Building, which is another Wright job. And on this site, before the Federal Building, was another Wright job, because if you were to walk down a street in Detroit or drive down a street in Detroit, you couldn't go more than a block realistically without hitting something that Wright had their hand in. So before the Federal Building was the Whitney Opera House, which was built by David Whitney, lumber baron in Detroit. And this was at Fort and Shelby Streets, where the Federal Building was. It was built in 1875, demolished in the 1890s, and its full interior, floor to ceiling, was decorated by the Wright Company. It also had allegorical women figures, including that represented the arts. So we include poetry, music, drama, tragedy, and comedy that were probably in the house of the theater. Another theater that we identified was the Grand Opera House in Detroit. This was the bane of my existence for a little while because this opera house had about 3 or 4 different owners and different names. And when they start appearing in the paper over time, you have to piece together whether this is the same building they're talking about, and whether this owner, who sold it to who, and all those details. Those are important to say, well, how long did this building survive? Does it perhaps still exist out there? You have to tell the complete story of the building. So we get this great interior of the Grand Opera House, which was at one point called the White Opera House. and it was described as having had a Moorish finish with blues and golds. Kind of sounds like the Senate chamber just a little bit. So again, we're drawing all these parallels for all their work. We talked about mentioned the special events category, and there's one really big one. The Detroit Art Loan Exhibition that was held in 1883 in Detroit. This was a temporary building built in Detroit, and it allowed all the rich guys in Detroit, all the wealthy people in Detroit to bring out their art collections. It allowed artists to show off their art, and it included the Wright Company. So they supplied some things, including two paintings. They loaned two paintings that had been from the Lewis Cass collection. So this speaks to them going out abroad and locally and finding the finest art available to offer to their clients. So presumably Lewis Cass had quite a collection. They had two pieces that went on display in the Art Loan exhibition. This stereograph from 1883 shows off the Macmillan room in the temporary exhibition. James Macmillan became a U.S. Senator from Michigan, but he was also quite an art collector. So this was the parlor room that was designed to house his collection for display, and it was supplemented with stuff from the Wright Company on loan, and they finished off the decoration and the finishes on the room. So they had a hand in this. Their names in the ledgers from the Art Loan exhibition. The Art Loan exhibition is not directly an ancestor to, but it inspired the Detroit Museum of Art, which then evolved into the Detroit Institute of Art. So that was something that had been on our mind at one point. With this being such a large art firm in Detroit, didn't have any connection to the DIA. We can say sort of the shirt tail connection going back to their very earliest sort of iteration of an art museum in Detroit. Let's talk about Lansing now. So we were delighted a little while back, a few months ago, to see all these new Lansing newspapers come online. Late 19th century was sort of a ghost town in terms of research for Lansing because none of the papers were digitized and searchable. Well, they are now, and that allowed us to do some quick and easy research, identifying some Lansing Wright jobs, too, done right around the time the Capitol is being decorated. So one of those is Buck's Opera House. And Buck's Opera House was on North Washington at Ionia Street. It was built it opened in 1873, and it was designed by Elijah Myers, our Capitol architect, named for Daniel Buck, who had been a mayor of Lansing. Something's happening here.
No.
I'm gonna keep talking about the Buck's Opera House. And I guess wait a minute. Did I bump something? We lost our Zoom people probably too, didn't we? Or are you still on there?
I think I'm still on.
Hey. Hopefully we still have that. I think we have that our Zoom people still. But so Buck's Opera House, again, North Washington, designed by Elijah Myers, and it was, let me find my notes here. In 1888, it was redecorated. The executors of the estate moved the entrance from the side entrance on Ionia, bumped it around to the front on Washington, and they fully redecorated the whole building, the whole house, the whole box office, and that was done by the Wright Company. And 1888 is during the Capitol's decoration project. Another job that we identified was the Plymouth Congregational Church. Plymouth was built in 1877, or opened in 1877, before the Capitol, sat right at the corner of Allegan and Townsend, overlooking the Capitol construction site. And this was maybe something that Lansing history folks didn't know. I certainly didn't know that Plymouth had a sizable addition put onto it in the 1890s. So and I didn't look up the correct terminology, but our cross gable through the center of the building, which you see here, was expanded. This is pre-addition. It was expanded, and then a back addition put on as well. And that meant an enlarged sanctuary and needing to redo all that artwork. So this was done in 1891, 92, and Plymouth was totally redecorated and included a terracotta and bronze design. Sounds like the house chamber. So we're seeing these recurring color themes here as well. Plymouth Spire poked out on Lansing skyline for many years. Unfortunately, it burned in 1971. And the Buck's Opera House was demolished in 1984. So we don't have either of these buildings either. There's two more homes that I want to talk about here. Maybe. Hey, there we go.
Going? Okay.
The Barnes Castle. So the Barnes Castle was built in the 1870s, also at the same time as the Capitol. And Orlando Mac Barnes was a railroad magnate. He was a lawyer, prosecutor, state legislator, mayor of Lansing. He was Mr. Lansing by all accounts. And he built this grand home on the banks of the Grand River in the 1870s. And there have been rumors about the Barnes Mansion for years. Did Mr. Barnes take capital labor and bring them over to his house site and pay them more to get his house built quicker or better? Well, we still can't substantiate that, but another rumor that had been circulating in Lansing for years is, did any of the Capitol's decorators go do jobs locally during the Capitol's construction, during the Capitol's decoration? Well, we can actually maybe do some substantiation here. So this drawing is from the Weidman collection, and it's of a design for a hall decoration is what it's labeled as. Has the right company stamp in the corner. If you look extra close on the left sort of ceiling design, there are orange sort of sections, and there's like a cipher in there. It says OMB. Well, who else could OMB be but Orlando Mac Barnes? So we then take this and say, that's great. We'd love for this to be Orlando Mac Barnes, the Barnes Castle. But let's try to do a little bit more substantiation. And we find some 1940s interior photographs. So the Barnes Castle was proposed as a governor's residence in the 1940s. That never came to pass. But this is a photo of the Grand Hall. And if you look above the fireplace on the ceiling, there's this fan design. If you look back to the drawing, there it is. There's a fan design. And there's also this triangular repeating pattern down the sides in both the drawing and in the picture. So we can fairly confidently say that the right company, Christian Weidman, had a hand in designing and decorating the Barnes Castle, which was abandoned in the 1920s and demolished in 1957. So it's another one we no longer have. One more house, maybe my favorite. Just for the story that comes along with it. So the Solomon Dresser home is outside of Michigan. It's maybe one of the few that we're talking about that's in the Great Lakes region, but not in Michigan. So the Dresser home was built for Solomon Dresser, who was an oil baron, a congressman in Pennsylvania, built in 1903. He had attended the Pan American Exposition in New York, in Buffalo, in 1901, and saw the Michigan building. The Michigan building at that exhibition was partially designed by Louis Camper, the Detroit architect, and Dresser loved that building, and he hired Camper to design his own home in Pennsylvania. And as if I didn't mention, he was born in Michigan. And Dresser was so proud of his home that he had a book published about it, which included interior photographs of every room. I'm happy he did that because it allowed us to do a little bit of work here. So Dresser's home was full of numerous rooms, but this top floor, probably where that balcony comes out, was a grand ballroom. This is what the ballroom looked like. It was called the French Ballroom and was described as having been frescoed in one delicate blue cloud with a faint suggestion of cherubs and garlands of roses, producing an almost atmospheric effect. I think that describes it well. Also has skylights up there. And looking at this, I couldn't help but draw some comparisons to another photograph. So if we think about the Weidman collection that we're talking about tonight, it's not just these beautiful works of art, it's family history and it's family photographs. So if we look at one of our family photographs, drum roll, we have this photograph. That man in the center with his hands down by his side with the beard, that's Christian Weidman, standing with his team at an unidentified job in which he was probably the foreman, standing with his work crew. Well, that room looks familiar to me. How about you? Yeah, so that is the French Ballroom in Bradford, Pennsylvania, at the Dresser Mansion. You'll see the mirror, wainscot work behind him, as well as all that sort of garland work on the ceiling. So this is a cool one. This building was ultimately donated as a nursing home in the 1950s and burned down in the 1980s. So another story of one that we no longer have. I am going to turn things now back over to Val to talk more about Christian Weidman and the family story.
So as we've been through the process of acquiring this collection, we've gotten to know some of the family members pretty well. And there have been a lot of discussions back and forth about family history because we're always interested in knowing the backstories of the people who are doing this work. And so the family has been kind enough to share their family tree with us, to share a lot of historical photographs with us, and to tell us more about how they believe Christian Weidman ended up in Michigan. So as I mentioned earlier, Christian emigrated with his brother Heinrich. They were born into a large German Lutheran family in what is today northern Germany. At this point in time, this was contested territory. And I will not try to pronounce this because everybody laughs at my bad German when I do, but they were there. And it is right up near the Baltic coast, actually. Okay, there we go. So we know that Christian and his brother Heinrich both actually lived itinerantly for a bit, to do their apprenticeship, to finish their training, and then they were journeymen who traveled around for work. So Christian spent time in both what is today Germany and Austria. He was actually in Vienna for a period, and some of the sketches in his collection are marked Vienna. So you can identify those if we only have the building as well. We also know that according to family tradition, he and Heinrich moved to the US to escape conscription in the Prussian army. So there's an international political bent to all of this. And when they come, they initially live with their sister Maria, who had already immigrated to Detroit, probably with her husband. She and her husband already had a home here. And so they come, Christian will start the process of becoming a citizen, and he will eventually marry another German immigrant. There's definitely a theme here to the story. His wife is Maria Wolf. She is going to have come to the US as a child with her parents. And keep in mind, these are just a few people in a huge German community in Detroit. Germans were the largest ethnic group in Detroit at this period in time, which is why they had a large German language newspaper, the Adorns Post, that Heinrich worked at as a printer and as a journalist. Now, ultimately, Christian and Maria will live a few different places. You'll hear more later tonight about how to kind of dig into the next level of research that we did on this. You can see a couple of their homes here. Focus on that one in the center, that beautiful early 20th century elegant Foursquare. That's a home they actually built for themselves. You know, in some ways, Christian and Maria lived the ultimate American dream. You know, the man with the old world skills who comes to the new world and is able to better himself and marry and have a family and thrive in business. And of course, we know that their interiors were done by the William Wright Company. No surprise on that newspaper article notice, certainly. Now, when we think about this family, we do have to remember this is a family. This isn't just a man who paints and decorates. So he does marry. He and his wife will have 8 children, 7 of whom live to adulthood. Heinrich or Henry, some of the family members went back and forth between their German and English names. He dies as a child. He is buried in Detroit. In fact, several of the family members are buried at Woodlawn Cemetery, which incidentally is the same cemetery Elijah Myers is buried in. So it's a very small world sometimes when you're thinking about these historical communities. And several of their children would go on to have professional careers, actually the girls as well as the boys. So several of the girls went into teaching, and one of them actually became a principal at a Detroit school. So this was a family who clearly embodied that stereotypical German work ethic in what they're doing. And we do have a few things from the other children that are also part of that collection. But of course, the most important line for us is that line coming down through Oscar. Oscar will work with his father. He may have worked on our job, we're not for sure. He would have been a teenager at the time, but certainly could have come to Lansing occasionally with Dad. And it is through Oscar, a German Lutheran who marries the daughter of Irish Catholic immigrants, which that's an interesting situation. They will have one daughter, Alma Weidman Swanson. And of course, this again is the line that the collection comes down through. I will say, we didn't include it in this presentation, but when we think about family and the artifacts, there are postcards, for example, from family back in Germany that they're communicating back and forth with. But one of my favorite things, and you'll see this in the exhibit upstairs, reproduced, there's a postcard that Christian sends. We think he's back in Lansing at this point, presumably to his family in Detroit. It's a postcard with a capital on front of it, and he basically writes on the back of it, "This is the building that I gave the best years of my life." So it's a very sweet tribute and tells us what this building meant to him in the scope of his work.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to talk about some of the art in the collection now. Now, the Capitol is really one of the best examples of the Wright Company's work that still survives today. We've got 9 acres of decorative artwork. So really a lot of room to look at the techniques and the motifs that the company would have used really across a lot of its commissions. So you can see here, this is a ceiling photo. This is the governor's parlor, and you can start to see several elements of decorative artwork standing out. So for example, repeated motifs. I'm looking at like the dark brown areas, these kind of rectangular areas, with the designs inside of them. So that's something that would be achieved with stenciling, which we'll talk about in just a second. You can tell the whole design is really very even, very balanced. With a lot of sketches, you've already seen some, and you'll see a couple more. Sometimes they'll just have 1/4 of the sketch done, with the idea that you could then, triple it. So repeat it 3 times and flip it to make the full ceiling design. So a little bit more efficient way to do a ceiling sketch as opposed to drawing out the whole ceiling every time. And then in this photo as well, if you look in the middle, you can see the gold leaf, so all that kind of shiny decoration where the light is meeting the ceiling there. So we do have gilding on many of our ceilings as well. This is real gold. It's just really thin pieces of gold, so hammered down to be super thin and stuck up there on the ceiling. Now you will see, and we've kind of mentioned this already, a lot of commonalities, a lot of standardized motifs kind of across all of their commissions. Really in general, decorative artwork is pretty standardized. So they'll use stencils, they'll draw from different maybe books or kind of study materials. And we'll look at a stencil here. So in our left corner there, you can see an example of what one of the stencils looks like that is in the collection. We've actually pulled some of the collection. So after this, if you want to glance, we do have that stencil pulled out on the left. And you can see evidence that it actually has been used. So you can see that red paint. When we look at the exhibit, we have a couple smaller ones with gold paint, so we know those have been used as well. And these are on heavier cardstock. They're pretty sturdy, so they could have been used repeatedly to make the same designs, make it more standardized. It's not all freehand that they're doing everywhere. Now you will also see the cartoon there, which is that longer kind of piece of paper along the bottom. Kind of a funny word for that. This is evidence kind of similar to stenciling of pouncing or the prick and pounce method. So this is a way basically to get a design up onto a wall. You would draw out the full scale design on a piece of paper with graphite or with charcoal, and then use something like an awl or a pouncing. There's a couple different pouncing tools you could use, like a needle or a pouncing wheel, which is essentially just a more efficient version of an awl. So there's multiple kind of pointy things that you can rotate around more efficiently, make those holes, spokes, I guess you could call them. So you're gonna make little holes along the entire design, and then you'll put it up on the wall or put it up on the ceiling and use a pouncing bag, which is oftentimes like a cheesecloth with charcoal powder inside or sometimes chalk powder inside. And then you'll kind of hit the pouncing bag against the stencil, and that charcoal or chalk will go through the holes so that when you peel away the design, you can actually see it up on the wall. Basically just a dotted outline of the design. And then you can go in and trace over it, paint over it, and that's how you basically transfer your design up onto the wall. So we have evidence that they're using those along with the stencils. So along with this, another way that they kind of keep that standardization in their designs is going to be drawing from different books, like ornamental books. So we do have one on display upstairs, which is a bit later, but the one you see here is The Grammar of Ornament by Owen Jones. Now, this was originally published in 1856, so it's possible they could have drawn from this. We don't know that for sure, but we do know that John Canning, who worked on our restoration in this building, did draw from it. He actually talks about it in the interview he did. So you can see there's all different cultures, all different styles of design that will be recorded in these books, and artists might study from them during their training, or they might refer back to them while they're creating designs. So really easy ways to kind of pull past designs or other cultures work with designs and incorporate that into what you're making. So if someone requests an Egyptian inspired ceiling, there you go, you've got some ideas of what to pull in there. Now, kind of along with that, this idea of having all of these standardized kind of repeated designs, there has come a debate between the idea of artist versus artisan. And so generally in art history and kind of just in the art world, people will consider artists people who are creating or inventing new and more original ideas, whereas artisans are copying patterns more mechanically. And so there's kind of a debate between this. The lines can blur, so traditional fine artists might have artisan training or might do artisan jobs, and vice versa. Artisans might have that fine art training. And really, this is something historically that has always been kind of a debate in art history. So for the longest time, there's the paragone, the comparison, where in Italian, where sculptors and painters are fighting over the merits of sculptures versus painting. You have people fighting over line versus color. This is kind of just one of those art history debates. But really, decorative artists and fine artists, a lot of the training will be quite similar. So training for decorative artists will really fall into two different categories. You'll have apprenticeships, and then you'll have more formal schooling. So early on, really apprenticeships was all that was available, and these are dating back to like the Middle Ages. Later, it will become more common for universities to start to offer arts training and then decorative arts training. So art schools themselves, those will begin back in the mid-16th century, early ones coming out of Italy, and then later on, it'll be more specialized into like the decorative arts as well. With the Adorns specifically, we don't have a record of formal training for Christians, so we probably would have apprenticed and then learned by doing along the way. He probably would have moved through an apprenticeship system. So these generally will start at about 12 or 14 years old as an apprentice, and it will take about 7 years to kind of fulfill that apprenticeship. And at the end of that apprenticeship, you'll become a journeyman. So this is someone who can travel and do the work, actually do their trade for pay. And then later on, you can go on to become a master tradesman. So that's someone who's going to be able to hire journeymen and apprentices underneath them. With Oscar, we do have evidence that he attended an art school. So he probably would have had the university training and some apprenticing, or he would have at least learned it from his father. But we know that he attended the Royal Art School in Berlin. This was founded back in 1869, and he was there for 1 year. So this would have been November of 1893 to November of 1894. You can see him here kind of posing as an artist. He's got potentially some of his art school friends around him in the photo there. And with some of the other art in our collection outside of just ceiling designs, we can really approach it as Oscar as an art student in training. So usually in art school, you'll have to study a bit of everything. So in our collection, along with those ceiling designs, we have anatomical studies, we've got portraits, sketches, different landscapes, still lifes. And so we pulled some of those for you, and you'll see some of those in the exhibit as well. With the ones you're seeing on the screen, we have some graphite and charcoal sketches. Now, most of these are going to be on sketchbook paper, so you can usually see tears. If you just, sketch it and point it out of the sketchbook. Some of them you can't see up here really, but in person you can see some pinholes in the corners, which I think also kind of leads us to conclude it might have been from an art school assignment. So generally in art school, you'll have I could say critiques. So you basically pin your art up on the wall and people will give their opinions. And these are known for being kind of intimidating. So I'm kind of wondering how it went for him going over to Germany and then having to go through these critiques with his art school colleagues. We can break the graphites and the charcoals into kind of a couple different categories. So you'll see anatomical studies like what's on the left. It is important for artists to know the anatomy of the body, so like bones and muscles inside the body, and then also what it looks like from the outside. You have to kind of know what's going on underneath the skin to really be able to render it realistically. So you can see he's practicing with some of the bones, trying to figure out the anatomy behind the body, and then you can see the arm as well. So from the outside, you can see the little veins, and he's kind of practicing, moving arms and different, appendages around and drawing those. And then you can also see we've got some ears, nose, eyes, mouth, so all of these areas of the face that are a little bit harder that you might need more practice in. So I'm kind of practicing with those as well. And then on the right, you'll see some decorative art elements. So these are probably out of his kind of art school sketches, be the ones most applicable to the ceilings and the wall designs that we're looking at. Kind of practicing with those. Along with that, we also have some other like portraits that we'll look at in that photo as well. Oh, sorry, I'm skipping these. We've got some other drawings too that'll show him kind of working through different stages of making artwork. So you can start with kind of a basic graphite drawing on the left and then move into pen and get more detailed as you go. And this is something that maybe he could use with some of his ceiling designs if he has a cartouche, so kind of a separate framed element in the ceiling. Sometimes you'll see figures in those. A lot of the ones that we see in our collection or like in our building, they're going to be like still life, so fruit and flower still lives, but could still be helpful for that. And then we'll look at the portraits. So here you're going to see a couple examples of portraiture in our collection, which are also on the tables over there. And I think a big part of the portraiture is not just practicing depicting, figures, but also working with different mediums. So you've got charcoal ones, which you can see an example of up there. He's working with pastels, so you can see the woman with kind of a blue background behind her is in pastel. It's going to be kind of a softer and more delicate medium, a little bit smoother look to the face, and just, able to blend a bit more. It's going to work similarly to charcoal, but there are some differences, so he's getting experience with that. And then that other portrait up on the right is a watercolor. And so again, that's going to operate differently than the other two mediums we talked about. The colors will bleed together a bit. You have to kind of be able to handle that a little bit differently. So he's really getting experience with all of these mediums. And then the other two, the kind of cityscape, landscape ones, these are going to be in gouache. So gouache is kind of like a thicker, more opaque not version of watercolor, but it's quite similar. You can add water to gouache to make it operate more like a watercolor. So they'll start to kind of bleed and blend together more. Or you can keep it thicker and a little bit more opaque. You can also combine like a white gouache into watercolor and make it kind of this like pastel watercolor. So there's a lot you can do with that. And a lot of the ceiling designs that we see have combinations of watercolor and gouache on them. And one on the left I pulled just to show you kind of over time, depending how things are stored, they might start to kind of fall apart a little bit. You'll see some cracking with the gouache, so it's kind of a delicate medium. We have to keep that in mind as we're taking care of the collection going forward, kind of make sure we don't lose too much more of the gouache than that's already kind of lost from there. Yeah. So aside from that, we do have some examples of the ceiling plans themselves. I know you've seen a couple, but just a couple more for you to look at. So you can see on the left some of those kind of quarter designs that you can imagine they would repeat and make into a full ceiling. There's also some notes on some of them. So bottom left, you'll see everything's meant to be edged in silver. So we have a note about that. Over on the right side too, you can see maybe not the quarter of it completed, but just different areas filled in with color and kind of fully fleshed out. And then in the middle, we've got an actual full design. And that's a pretty good example of what the gouache looks like when it's, all put on there, not cracking, pretty put together. So yeah, we have, after this, if you want to look at some of them up close, you can kind of see what those mediums look like. But I think that this is a pretty good example of kind of as a whole of what the collection has given us as far as research and kind of helping substantiate some of our theories. And I think really as a whole as well, the collection serves as a reminder of how important it is to keep and care for not only art, but also photographs, family papers, all of these things that in passing might not seem as important as they will become in the future. It can really help to enlighten people and shape their understanding of history years and years down the road. So again, I think we've already said this multiple times, but we're super grateful to have this collection and to have been able to work with it and the way that we have now. And with that, if you have any questions, if you're online, if you want to drop them in the chat, or if you're in person, you can raise your hand and we can answer some of those for you.
Questions?
What?
We covered everything thoroughly.
They're like, no, we just want to go upstairs.
Do any of the current generations of the Whiteman family, are they continuing the art? Or they have moved on to other occupations?
That one.
So the question for those of you who are online was, are any of the Weidman family still currently in art? Not the current generation that I'm aware of, but there was a family member who died a few years ago who was. So there are people who are still very interested in it, but no one has been able to pursue it as a career at this point in time within the family. Other questions? Nick?
So I have two questions. One is about labor and then the other is about the creative process.
Okay.
So the creative process question is, on a project like this, in my mind, like you have an artist like in a room envisioning whatever it is that they want to create, whether it's on canvas or sculpture, and they basically work to make that vision come about. Is that how the creative process would work on a project like this? Is there sort of a singular individual who is making final decisions on the designs and motifs and other things, or is it kind of more by committee, or like how are those kind of decisions made?
Okay, so the question is, what do we know about how the creative process works for these jobs? Is there a single person making decisions, kind of laying out that general vision, or is everything being done by groups? So we can only answer so much of that. This collection has led us to believe that Christian would have been the lead on that, certainly for our capital, and in general was considered a lead for the right company. He's often listed as a foreman. He is also in some sources listed as the lead designer for the capital project. So based on those attributions and based on just what we see in this collection and the fact that we recognize a lot of things that end up upstairs in the building, lead us to say he was probably the driving force behind that. That is not to say though that other people weren't contributing potentially, and it's also not to say that there weren't other people giving opinions on things.
So the question about labor is, because it was mentioned that you would start as a journeyman, or you would start as a apprentice, be journeyman, come eventually to a master. So like the folks that are working on a job like this, are they like guild associated? Are they organized labor associated? Like typically the folks that are actually putting the things on the wall or involved in that process, like how are those people identified, and are there associations that advocate for their
Sure.
kind of thing?
So are there associations who advocate for these people? Is there a specific guild or journeyman setup? And what do we know about those connections? So we don't know much with the right company. I don't think we ever came across any suggestions that they were hiring union people or in union circles at that time. The right company will exist from the 1850s into the 1930s. So they cover quite a huge time span. We don't know if their workers at some point in time were unionized or not. My impression has always been, and this is a very vague, this comes with a disclaimer that my understanding of this is very vague, is that there was never as formal of a guild system in America as there was in Europe. So my guess is they came up, Christian and Heinrich, both as a printer, came up through a more formal structure in Europe. And when they got to America, things were a little more loose. I have often wondered how much kind of internal training a company like Brightstar may have done, grabbing people's sons and young people interested who can just kind of train up within the company. But even if you think about decorative artists who work on the building today, they come different routes. Some of them have a fine arts degree, but this is what ends up paying the bills. Some of them come up through more of an apprentice system, many of them in Europe still, and then they come to America because there's work here as well. So I'm not sure, can anyone else speak to that?
So
Brian?
we do have the 1919 card. Oscar is the building.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that. Yeah.
So it's part of our.
That's for the online.
So part of our collection, we received some ephemera and documents from the family as well. One of them is a 1919 Building Trades Council membership card for Oscar Biden. So a little bit after the time of the Capitol, but imagine there were societies in place in Detroit at least.
Hillary, when we were doing work on the Mars and the Capitol, the year after everything was completed, the protest driving the legislation to ban anyone who was not a citizen or has not declared the intention to be a citizen, which would enough to vote in elections at that point. It was driven in part by a painters union, and the senator who was lobbying for this legislation had ties to that union. There was also strong support for a Detroit artist named Hopkins, who later on, it was a Hopkins Club, and it still survives in another form today. But so there was union activity at that point. Now, whether rights workers were involved in union, I don't know.
Okay.
There was a lobbying on the part of kind of a painters union.
Interesting. Okay.
That's indicated in the Michigan History magazine that deals with the controversy about why Mars was never counted. So you may want to check back. I can check back.
We'll check that out.
Memory doesn't always serve it well as we hope it will. I would check that out because there's some detail about that union activity or that protest.
Okay.
In that particular article in Michigan History magazine.
Thank you, Doug. I'd forgotten about that. Did I see a hand somewhere else? Okay, so what are instructions from here?
So this is the end of our virtual presentation. For folks watching virtually,
later this summer, the plan is that we'll be putting together a video going into more detail of the exhibit itself. And so if you watch our Facebook page this summer, that'll be coming out probably toward the end of the summer. For folks attending in person, it is time, if you'd like now, to go upstairs to see the exhibit. It's up on the ground floor east wing. So feel free to follow us on up here. If you want to take a moment and take a look at some of the art that Shayla's pulled here, some of the examples you talked about in the presentation, you can do that as well. And for folks who join us upstairs, there's going to be a short game of I Spy up on the 3rd floor as well. So if you stick around for another 20 minutes or so, you should be able to see everything upstairs. Josh?
Sorry, before you dismiss us, there's got to be a round of applause for some great presentations tonight.
Thank you very much.
Did you recognize one scene that, Oscar?
When you were giving the SSI group
the
the
round-
today,
the round-
the governor's office,
Yeah.
and I wanted to memorize this stat because I want to use it. You said that it was it 4 months?
Yeah. We just talked about this last week. with-
Say the way you said it.
Yeah, so I had historically said 4 months period, but I've clarified with Val, it was 2 artists, 2 months each. 4 months total of
Using
cleaning,
Q-tips.
using
Cleaning
Q-tips.
it.
Yeah,
So it's the original artwork.
it is. There's infilling where there were
Yeah, oh,
losses,
yeah.
but it's mostly original.
2 artists, 2 months, Q-tips.
Yeah,
I love that.
yeah, it's a good detail. I
Yeah,
try to use it every
I like
time.